Some doctors have begun to say the quiet parts about advanced care planning out loud.
Well, there's so many things that we talk about that I think, this would be very interesting to the public, but it's not useful and it's potentially harmful, so let me not say it.
Today we ask, does advanced care planning work? As we present Doctors Daniela Lamas and Ira Byock in conversation.
Would it be useful for me to make instructions about specific interventions that I think I would be willing to tolerate in some future hypothetical scenario of illness? I don't really think so.
I don't think that advanced care planning writ large is something we should move away from entirely, but it clearly has been poorly designed, and as we've been doing it, it is clearly broken.
The future of advanced care planning today on the Hear Me Now podcast, which comes to you from the Providence Institute for Human Caring. Hi everybody, I'm Sean Collins. Glad you're with us. The movement towards making advanced care planning a routine part of medical care in this country started in the 1970s. 50 years later, one view holds that we've made progress towards normalizing the discussion of care options between providers and patients and families before there's a crisis. Another view is that advanced care planning has failed. In October of last year, the Journal of the American Medical Association ran an opinion piece that posits, quote, "Many clinicians may be disappointed that promoting conversations with patients well in advance of needed medical decisions has not improved subsequent care as hoped." That piece was written by Drs. Morrison, Diane Meier, and Robert Arnold, 3 palliative care physicians in New York and Pennsylvania. None of us has a crystal ball, one that gives us a clear view of the circumstances of our final illness. So we find ourselves triangulated, balanced uneasily on a 3-legged stool. One leg tries to put your wishes in writing, even at the risk that that document becomes outdated by the realities and tragedies of the moment. The second leg advocates for naming a surrogate decision maker, a trusted proxy who can speak for you when you're not able to speak for yourself. And the third leg is plain old-fashioned denial, where we ignore the need for any sort of planning at all. Dr. Daniela Lamas is a pulmonologist and a critical care physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. She's also a frequent contributor to the op-ed pages of the New York Times. In early January, she wrote a piece that the paper headlined, "When Faced with Death, People Often Change Their Minds." In it, she writes, quote, "Since the Patient Self-Determination Act of 1990 went into effect, advanced care planning, which encourages all adults, even those in good health, to choose a surrogate to make medical decisions and to draw up an advanced directive, that has been promoted as a way to make sure that people receive the care they want at the end of their life. But this well-intentioned effort has not worked as promised." End quote. Dr. Lamas is our guest today, along with Dr. Ira Byock, palliative care physician, author, and longtime advocate for the best care possible throughout life. Ira is also the founder of the Providence Institute for Human Caring, under whose aegis this podcast is produced. We've invited these 2 physician leaders to the program today for a frank conversation about the efficacy of advanced care planning and the controversy that's swirling in some clinical circles these days. I'm so pleased to welcome the 2 of you. Dr. Lamas, let's start with you. Do you really think that advanced care planning is for naught?
Thank you for having me on, and even your introduction made me think, and really, this is such a complicated but important topic to think about. And it's important because I think, needless to say, it translates into, what recommendations we make for people, for everybody, really. Do I think advanced care planning is for naught? I mean, I think it depends how we define our terms. I think that the word advance itself raises questions. Do I think that it would be useful for me in good health, whose view of illness comes from, being in the MICU as a doctor frequently, but never experiencing it, thankfully, myself or in close family members? Would it be useful for me to make instructions about specific interventions that I think I would be willing to tolerate in some future hypothetical scenario of illness? I don't really think so. Would it be useful for me to decide on a healthcare proxy? Sure. But when we think about advance, I mean, I'm assuming here that this is far in advance of something. I think advanced care planning, though, if it looks like sort of thoughtful conversation about serious illness with somebody who has already received a serious diagnosis and is sort of looking down the pike and seeing these things being possible, I think that kind of advanced care planning is necessary. So I think it really just depends on how we define our terms.
Well, I agree entirely with what you just said, and I want to thank you for the opinion piece that you wrote for the Times. It really advanced the conversation quite a bit in our field, and I think in the general public. My colleagues, Sean Morrison, Diane Meier, and Bob Arnold, did us a service in surfacing this issue and the really difficult to track outcomes of all of the energy that we put into advanced care planning in American healthcare. I agreed with part of what they said strongly, but the flavor of the piece I felt was unduly nihilistic and defeatist. And I think as you started in this conversation, Daniela, you said it really depends on what you're using as terms. I don't think that advanced care planning writ large is something we should move away from entirely, but it clearly has been poorly designed, and as we've been doing it, it is clearly broken. Right. Even in their piece, we have to distinguish the process of advanced care planning from the forms that we have given people, these advanced directive documents, which are clearly broken, and I hope to come back to that. But the other thing is that as you also just surfaced, that the word advance is a bit of a challenge, and I want to I don't want this to be in any way promoting of only promoting of what we've been doing through the Institute for Human Caring and at Providence, but we've recognized that the forms are a problem and that the process is broken quite a few years ago, and we have been very intentionally redesigning goal-aligned care and the processes and tools for goal-aligned care now for quite a few years. And so we see it as advanced care planning is what happens well before somebody is seriously ill or needs to make these decisions, though it could happen near the end of a patient's illness if they haven't done any of this before. But it is intended to be just something that adults do to complete their healthcare record, frankly. Give us somebody name somebody you trust to speak for you who, if heaven forbid you were in a health crisis, you would want us to talk with about making decisions about your care. And then we've added and provide some general information about your orientation toward life-saving treatments, if you wish to, as guidance for the person you just named and your future doctors. But even that's optional. And then we've been talking about shared decision-making, or the term we use as goals of care conversations, which is also not a perfect term, but is intended to talk about or intended to refer to shared decision making when somebody is diagnosed with a serious illness. And even that is intended to be an iterative process which changes as the illness either progresses or gets better. So I think they tended to, lump things together in a way that was provocative and did indeed start quite a debate within our field, but but ultimately I think dissolves into its parts.
I mean, I hear that. I admit I was hesitant initially to bring this from sort of the medical literature and the sort of inner circle of like palliative care experts where this conversation has lived, and into the lay public, and had some very helpful conversations with Sean Morrison and then James Tulsky at my hospital and Susan Block, really with the question of, is this okay? Can I write about this? And, not that somebody can necessarily tell you what or what not to write about, but, is this a conversation that is sort of ready and useful? There are so many things that we talk about that I think, this would be very interesting to the public, but it's not useful and it's potentially harmful, so let me not say it. And so this one, I debated about, and I think the reason that it is useful is raising the questions that you bring up, which is that perhaps it is not necessary to ask a loved one about specific interventions on a form that they can't imagine. And yes.
It's actually counterproductive. It's really nonsensical.
Yes.
I mean, I'm a guilty party here. I mean, I was practicing back in the early 80s. I have been a champion for advanced care planning and the old style of advanced directives for, oh my gosh, decades. And I can't tell you how many calories I've burned, how many public talks, how many grand rounds and things that I've done in my career to advance directives. And I wish I hadn't, because they are flawed, and I want to say some things that I plan to actually write about in the not too distant future, but just to get your reaction to.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Where to start? So all of this starts way back, of course. I mean, here's a quote that I recently just refound. It may be familiar to you. Every human being of adult years and sound mind has a right to determine what shall be done with his own body. And a surgeon who performs an operation without his patient's consent commits an assault for which he is liable in damages. This is true except in cases of emergency where the patient is unconscious and where it is necessary to operate before consent can be obtained. Is that familiar to you?
I mean, the concepts are familiar. I admit to ignorance as to the specific quote, though.
Yeah. So this comes from a 1914 court decision by Justice Benjamin Cardozo in what has become a famous case of Schollendorf versus Society of New York Hospital, where a woman who had a surgery performed that she hadn't consented to, later developed gangrene and had an amputation and sued the hospital for damages. And although she lost, because they basically said you can't sue the hospital, you could sue your surgeons, the opinion is really cited often as the beginning of goal-aligned care, and the notion that any adult of sound mind should be able to refuse any treatment that is offered to him or her, and that really subsequent decisions have said that you don't even have to give a reason for why you're refusing the treatment. You just have to say, no, I decline, and your right needs to be protected. So then scrolling forward, right, we come to Karen Ann Quinlan case in New Jersey. She was born in 1954, and she was a young woman who had a car accident, ended up in a persistent vegetative state. Family petitioned for her ET tube, or her ventilation to be discontinued, which was ultimately the New York State Supreme Court said yes, and that established the right to refuse, a surrogate's right to refuse for you. The Nancy Cruzan case in the early 1980s further solidified. This was in Kansas, and they said if you have clear and compelling evidence, or it was almost a criminal level of evidentiary evidence, but you could refuse. It was said that she didn't have that, so the court said that life-saving treatments needed to be continued, but that was strong evidence that advanced directives are needed. And then many of us, including myself, were active in trying to promote this idea. And then back to, again, Senator Danforth's from, I think, Missouri's Patient Self-Determination Act from 1990, which said that every place that receives Medicare funds needs to at least ask adults if they wanted to have an advance directive. But what happened thereafter was the advance directives were designed by attorneys on the chassis of contracts.
Got it.
And they were designed so that to protect you from things that you didn't want. I don't want CPR. I don't want this tube in my throat. I don't want dialysis or medically administered nutrition and hydration. I have trouble as a doc who practiced family medicine, emergency medicine for quite a few years, and hospice and palliative medicine. I would have trouble writing an advance directive and saying whether I wanted or did not want mechanical ventilation, dialysis, medically administered nutrition, hydration. I'd have to know, well, what condition am I in?
Yeah.
You know, did I just have a car accident, had a head injury, might wake up,
Yeah.
could still do a crossword puzzle, maybe,
Right.
You know, or am I riddled with cancer? You're reading this when I don't have any chance whatsoever of life that's worth living to me, right?
Right.
So it's impossible to do that.
Right.
If I could go one step further, the attorneys on that contractual chassis required for this to be a legal document, your advance directive, which was first called a living will, for it to be either notarized by a notary public or witnessed by two people who are unrelated to you and not your doctor, right?
Right. So interesting.
And I got to tell you that requirement is what often makes these advance directives landfill, because I can give them to a patient, and if the patient is able to complete what they want or don't want, I then have to say, and please have this witnessed by two people who don't know you or notarized, and bring it back to us, right?
Yeah.
Never happens. I mean, it happens rarely, right?
Yes.
Which is why even in well-functioning systems, about 30% of adults have these documents. And I guess I'll turn it back to you and say, are you aware of any data whatsoever that shows any added value to having documents, advanced care planning documents, witnessed or notarized?
It's fascinating. I am not aware of any data, nor sort of just intuitively from sort of a human perspective do I think that it feels like such a disincentive. You're already talking about a subject that is largely unimaginable and for most scary. And then it also is so counter to the spirit of what these should be, right? Which are living documents that change depending on where you're at, change depending on the context, exactly as you said, rather than a legal binding decision that carries you through until time. Of course, that carries you through time. I mean, that's not what we ever intended them to be. So. Yeah.
I had an aha moment a number of years ago when colleague of ours, Dr. Joseph Finns at NYU, he's a clinical ethicist, internist clinical ethicist, wrote a wonderful paper called From Contracts to Covenants or something. I think it was along those lines. And Joe observed that advanced directives were built on this sort of contractual chassis, and contracts exist to protect you from future harm, right? But most people want decisions about care, their own care in life-threatening situations, to be made in a covenantal fashion by people they inherently trust, who they know have their backs, who are going to act in their best interests. And he pointed out that we're going about this in the wrong way.
I mean, I think that's sort of resonates clearly with the kinds of questions, with what we're talking about. And I think the question of harm is interesting too. I mean, it is framed in a way that, which, perhaps is fair for the way a lot of people feel about the medical system, but it is saying of protecting you against people who are going to do things that are not in your best interest. And, if people, and clearly we need to do a lot to build trust, but if people said, all right, like I sort of, to what you were saying earlier about what you ask people to fill out, are you somebody who would tend to be a more intervention person or a less intervention person? Acknowledging that might shift depending on what these interventions, where they can get you and where your situation is. If you could say, well, look, I'm kind of a more intervention person if you can get me back to something that's, sort of like what I was before. Exactly. And then you trust your doctors to play it out. Exactly. But that's not, but nobody, so, I think people want to come in. That feels in the ICU, like families, that is often what people want. But then they're tangled up but there was this thing that they told me they would never want this, or they told me they would always want this, and how does that align? And yeah, I think it becomes confusing, and often these statements that people make are not helpful, but end up being sort of harmful.
Exactly. So I want to get to how we're reconceptualizing this, because I'm really eager for your response and see. Let me say one other thing, which is that I later ended up doing some research with Joe Finns. We tested this. We actually got a bunch of patients and their surrogate decision-making dyads together, and we gave them a series of hypothetical cases, but they're cases that are pretty resonant, and I won't go through it because it's a pretty complex design, but we asked basically people who said, I wouldn't want anything done, or if you were to say to your surrogate, I wouldn't want anything done, and then you ended up with a pneumonia, and the doctor said to your surrogate, well, we think that within a few days of ICU care, he could probably completely recover. What do you think? And if your surrogate decided to do that, even though the surrogate knew that you had said, no, never, would you feel betrayed, right? And we did the other valence, the exact opposite valence as well. I want everything done, but then after 2 weeks of, being in the ICU and you were, clearly not responding, and there was the doctor said there was no physiologic chance of you recovering, and your surrogate decided, yes, let's let you die gently, would you feel betrayed, right? So we did all of this, right? In general, but basically the bottom line was that about 85 to 90% of people said, no, I'd be okay with whatever they decided. Supporting this hypothesis that people really do want their decisions made in this kind of covenantal, trusting relationship. Yeah. So that's been bouncing around my brain for a number of years. In the last few years, what we've tried to do is, again, separate advanced care planning from goals of care or shared decision making during serious illness. Right. And then say that as a standard, which is basically aspirational, our health system sees the naming of someone you trust to speak for you, if you can't speak for yourself, to be completing your healthcare record.
Okay.
Just like we ask everybody for allergies to medications, we may not be anticipating that we're going to give you something that's going to cause an anaphylactic shock reaction, but we'd be negligent if we didn't have that in your record. It wouldn't feel complete. And in fact, there's hard stops for sending somebody to surgery or doing, some cancer treatment if we don't have the allergy list complete. Mm-hmm. So we've been saying that all adults, age of 18 or over, I just mentioned the Karen Ann Quinlan case, Nancy Cruzan, I could throw in Terry Schiavo.
Right.
They were all healthy young women who did not have serious diagnoses, who ended up in circumstances that caused major crises within their families, and all of those three became quite public.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That's smart.
Now, what we've done in the last, 3 years is we redesigned one of the forms of advanced directives. Mm-hmm. We call it our easy form. It's a single page form. It actually came from a conversation I once had with a guy named Chris Smith, a wonderful primary care doctor in Seattle, who one day on a call with me said, Ira, can't we just create a one-page simple advanced directive form that could be completed in a single visit?
Well, yes.
Sure. So our easy form has 3 parts. 1, who would you trust to speak for you if you couldn't speak for yourself? Mm-hmm. Give us name and contact information. Second, and this is the part I'll spend a tiny bit of time on, Daniela, give us your general preferences as guidance to the person you just named. Tell us about your general preferences about treatments in life-threatening situations. Mm-hmm. Are you somebody who the statement resonates, I want to continue living even if my quality of life seems low to others and I'm unable to communicate with people? In general, I would accept support for my breathing, heart, and kidney function by machines that require me to be in a hospital or special care unit. Or, second, life is precious, but I understand we all die sometime. I want to live as long as I can interact with others and enjoy some quality of life. I would accept intensive treatments only if I had a reasonable chance of getting better. I would refuse long-term support by intensive medications or machines if my quality of life was poor and I was unable to communicate with other people. Third, it is most important to me to avoid suffering. I do not want extraordinary medical treatment such as breathing machines or cardiopulmonary resuscitation. If my natural body functions fail, I would refuse treatments and choose to die naturally. We added a fourth that we put first in the form. And it says, I am not sure at this time which statements below I agree with. I trust my healthcare agent to do what is best for me. And then the third section is have witness or notarization to make it a legal document. So I have one more iteration of this, but I'll pause. And what do you think about that approach to a document?
I think, first of all, I think the sort of, deciding on a healthcare proxy entirely makes sense. I was going to say particularly if a family is complicated, but families are all complicated. So particularly if you have a family, and also if you don't. So yes, I think I would love to think more about these options. I think those really do encapsulate what we kind of want to know from people when we're asking their family members, tell me, like, what kind of person is this? Like, is this the kind of person who would be willing to go through anything? Who would be willing to be alive at all cost? What kind of life would they find meaningful? I think that encapsulates that. And I love the fact that, you put first the I don't know, so that in a way, if there's anything important to ordering, it encourages people not to make a choice unless they really do feel strongly about one of these choices. So I think that's great. One question I have, and I just don't know the answer to this, is to what extent do you believe that these sort of types of approach are sort of intrinsic to the person, or sort of shift over time? And is the idea that this is revisited sort of when health status changes, or how does that work? I simply don't know. Like, I wonder about that. What changes? Like, when you become closer to the point where the only way that you will be alive is in a limited fashion, is what you're willing to accept different than it would be sitting here in good health, where I say, I wouldn't want to be alive that way.
I don't have data from any studies on how often people's general preferences change, but come to think of it, it doesn't really matter, because our processes and our kind of clinical kind of protocols need to accommodate even the occasional person for whom they might change. Right. So in general, what I've been teaching over the years is, I think it's the 4 or 5 Ds, I can never remember, but these ought to be revisited as part of routine health maintenance every decade, or at times of a serious diagnosis. That's number 2.
Gotcha.
Particularly the diagnosis of early dementia is number 3. At times of divorce, or at times where there's been a death in the family of somebody close to you.
That's fantastic.
So all of those key life events should trigger, it's time to take a look and see if you still agree with who you named, because you may now be divorced from that person, or they may have died, or they may have dementia and no longer able to discharge their role as you assign them. But your own preferences, of course, may have changed as well.
Right. Well, that makes sense.
So let me tell you the other thing we've done, because I'm as I was reading, the editorial that sparked your piece, your article, which touched me a lot and resonated with a lot of people, but me as well. I've been getting increasingly excited about how we've not been nihilistic, but really leaned in to try to redesign this. So the other thing we did was, even that easy form still has to be witnessed or notarized, which again, we've created like sign-free zones in our clinics. We really want you to do this, but you can't do it here, right? It's bizarre. And the hospitals are even worse. What we did was, we said, okay, well, we're going to create another document that is exactly like our easy form, that sections 1 and 2 are exactly alike, but instead of the witnessed and notarization, we're going to put a statement there that says the patient I am meeting with today has capacity to make healthcare decisions, and then it is signed by a doctor, nurse practitioner, or PA, somebody with a independent license. So the signature attests to the person's decisional capacity and then records their verbally expressed wishes on this easy form, which we have labeled a trusted decision maker declaration. And we went all the way through governance in our very large health system to have the trusted decision maker form acknowledged by policy as a legitimate expression of a patient's wishes, unless or until it is replaced or supplanted by a formal advance directive.
That's great. I mean, that sort of decreasing the barrier to entry, to me, and encouraging it to be a conversation with your clinician.
Right. Right.
Who knows you and now knows you better. I think is vastly preferable to having it notarized. nobody's going to notarize something twice. Like I feel like I have failed. There's definitely sort of like medical forms that just have not happened for me, because the idea of finding a notary is one of the hardest things that you can ask me to do. It's very hard.
It's really hard.
You have to go to a bank or something. It's really, really confusing. And yeah.
And it's kind of this antiquated construct. It's like, I was thinking earlier today, actually, in thinking about the conversation we're going to have. It's like we're driving a V8. My GTO, which I had an old GTO when I was in medical school in 1974, right? And it's like we're trying to drive it today. It was beautifully designed and engineered then, real muscle car. I loved it, right? But we're living in a at least a hybrid, if not an all-electric world. Right. Like, you wouldn't build that thing now, and yet we're still using these paper documents. Yes. Asking for notarization, which really doesn't add value, and then we're saying, I don't know why we're failing. This doesn't seem like it's working.
If people have the information that you elicit in this form, I mean, that would be helpful in an ICU. That would be helpful.
Right. And having, I haven't spent as much time in ICUs as you have, but I've spent many, many days working in ICUs and in my roles. And I agree. Like, you want something that's useful. It makes no sense to me whether somebody, said, yes, I'll have antibiotics, but I don't, I don't want pressors, or I don't want, it makes no sense.
That's Dr. Ira Byock, Senior Vice President for Strategic Innovation and the founder of the Providence Institute for Human Caring. And on the line from Boston, Dr. Daniela Lamas, a pulmonary and critical care physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital and a frequent contributor to the op-ed pages of the New York Times. I want to let you know that we're planning a webinar for healthcare providers where we'll dive deep into the place of social media in your practice. Where are the lines being drawn? Where are the guardrails? Do you have questions about best practices for clinicians and the use of social media? If so, we want to hear from you. Drop us an email, hearmenowstories@providence.org, or leave us a voicemail on 424-212-5436. I'll repeat that number at the end of the program. Okay, back to our guests, Dr. Daniela Lamas and Ira Byock, and their conversation on advanced care planning on the Hear Me Now podcast.
So here's an idea. I want to pitch an idea to you, but
please.
Okay, so imagine if we had a coalition of major health systems, all of which I would bet have less than half, probably less than 40% of their adult patients have advanced directives on file. So what would it be like if a integrated health systems across the country came together and said, we want to create a community standard for goal alignment, and that is built in a different way, that uses a form somewhat like what I just described, and that uses the attestation of a licensed physician, nurse practitioner, PA, that says the patient has decisional capacity, and this is who they appointed, and this is in general what they said they wished, including, I just don't know, talk to the person I appointed. In a sense, I think, and I hope, this would begin to move the needle and establish a new, credible, and probably it would need to go through the courts to see if the courts agreed, but my sense is that the courts would probably smile on these documents as strong evidence of the patient's wishes, and we might get ourselves beyond the being tied to the chassis of this kind of muscle car contractual model.
Would you, so in this scenario, are you thinking that you would you begin with sort of a high risk population? Or are you saying, maybe, but you're saying the goal is sort of everybody who passes through this health system, every adult has this in the record?
I would start, I guess it's integrated. So I'd love this to be a focus of primary care.
Okay.
I mean, we are in a digital world, right? We are, it's the things are not like they were in the 80s and the early 90s.
Right.
So, for instance, the trusted decision maker tool I actually used during the pandemic when we were doing telehealth consults to emergency departments around goals of care conversations. And I could complete a trusted decision maker by phone or a telehealth visit and enter it into the patient's electronic health record. And by policy within Providence, that could stand as good faith evidence of the patient's chosen decision maker and general preferences, right? It's designed to function well in an environment that is much more common today because we may be even having primary care visits by telehealth.
Yeah.
More and more than we were. So yes, I kind of see this as the entry as ambulatory or primary care, but I also want to keep in mind, who's going to be using this when a stroke happens, bad car accident, advanced progressive illness. So I do think that this design would ease the way of families, and we ought to come back to why these things are valuable, because I think they're mostly valuable to families even more than to patients later, and the clinicians that are caring for them during a crisis.
No, I agree. I'm just wondering, a lot of the, or some of at least the arguments about advanced directives not sort of meeting their goals has been, well, it's not benign because a lot of training, sort of physician hours and money goes into this. So I was wondering, do we need training of clinicians to go through this form with somebody? But the way you're saying it, no, I mean, this is in lay language. It's saying this is who you are right now with whatever health status you have and whatever you've seen in your life. Tell me about yourself, or you don't know, which is also fine. So it actually seems like there's not any sort of significant barrier, nor is it binding, which is what I like the fact that you don't need a notary. I like the fact that it's saying, this is who I am. But, it also relies on clinicians' judgment to say, is there a chance things can be okay or not? Because, these categories are saying, well, I'm somebody who, if things really aren't going to be okay by any stretch of the imagination, I'd still be willing to live, or I wouldn't. But that relies on a clinician's judgment, and that changes over the course of an admission. So, you allow a trial of critical care in that. I think all of that is, because you don't know which category you're going to end up in until you've tried some things.
Right. And for what it's worth, we've had this in practice now within Providence, and it has affirmed my clinical experience. I've asked people for years, even during hospital visits, before we conclude the visit today, after a new consult in palliative care, for instance, I see that you've never filed one of those advanced directive forms. Let me ask, who would you trust to speak for you if, heaven forbid, you had a stroke or something bad happened today, And the large majority of people can give you at least one person they trust to speak for them. So I can complete the essential part of that form in a single visit, usually in a few minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, right? And then they might have to think a little bit further about their general preferences. But I got to tell you, for my experience has been when you start asking people if they want ventilation or dialysis or something, they usually say, well, I don't know, leave that with me. I got to talk to my family. And then again, it's landfill. You never see it again.
Which is honestly the best outcome, because if they're just being like, no, I don't want a ventilator. I mean, I don't want a ventilator. Like, who wants any of that? But would I be willing to tolerate it if I needed to get through a catastrophic injury or illness? Yes. But that's not in that form. So I think what you ask does allow for that. And probably people can answer it or know that they can't answer it fairly quickly.
Yeah. So I know our time is getting a little
within the system of providence, but yeah.
Yeah, it's working pretty well. I mean, we're still at the beginning of socializing something across a health system with 53 hospitals and thousands and thousands of doctors and 120,000 employees. Takes a while, but we have some early adopters that are loving this approach. I also took exception with the editorial saying, there's no evidence that these discussions and these forms have any positive impact. And I was reminded of that phrase, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We may be trying to measure the wrong things.
I agree.
And I don't know. I assume you read Randy Curtis's editorial.
I was actually about to say that to you. Yes, yeah.
And Randy, I've known Randy for years, and that resonated with me. And I have an advance directive not because I have a serious illness, but because I have a wife and daughters. Right. The very fact, even today, in my very good health, the fact that I have an advance directive to lessen their burden gives me a sense of confidence right now. That is real benefit to me. It's not trivial because having spent so much time in emergency medicine and the like, I recognize that I could die at any day or I could have a car accident, but it lessens my burden. And then as Randy discussed in his own family, how many times have I been in a family meeting for a patient with a bad trauma, sepsis, stroke, and simply being able to look at a document that has their general preferences, or talk about, if there is no document, tell me about your mom and what she loved most in life and what gave her life meaning and what was her general feelings about healthcare. That making that pivot ease the burden that the family was feeling. We haven't measured it, but it sure seems pretty obvious.
No, I do agree with that. I do agree. And I think getting back to the first question that we were asked and that we were talking about, and to the word, the point of the word advance, I mean, I argue that it's not entirely clear that for Randy Curtis now to have that conversation, even people who are arguing there's no benefit to way advanced care planning would probably say that, having a conversation about goals and values when you have been diagnosed with ALS, that is actually no longer advance, that is sort of serious illness care planning. And so perhaps the benefits that are yielded to him and his family are different, though equally important. They're clearly than the benefits for me to talk to my family, I guess, is all I'm saying, that there's something different there.
For our listeners, we should clarify that Randy Curtis is a fabulous critical care doc, a thought leader in both critical care and palliative care, who has been diagnosed with bulbar ALS and wrote a response, I think, to the JAMA op-ed talking about the importance and value of advanced care planning in his own life with his parents' illnesses and now with his own. But not well measured. Right. So the fact that we can't measure things means that we have to refine our measurement schemas, but also, we shouldn't be overly nihilistic here. No,
I agree. And I think, in the story that I told in this piece where a patient sort of seemed to change her mind, ultimately her proxy knew what she wanted. What her proxy ended up deciding aligned with what she wanted. And they had conversations that were broad about, he knew what was important to her, even if it didn't actually say specifically, even if it was not the same as what had been on a document. And so I think that those conversations are important on many levels, both the information that is given and also just the trust, and saying things that are scary and knowing that you can say them. So, and the fact that that's unmeasured or unmeasurable even doesn't mean it doesn't matter. I do agree with that.
I'll say one other thing before we start to close and leave this topic, and that is we're so committed to outcome measures, and I think there are ways to measure the outcomes of goal-aligned care, but I also think there is intrinsic value in this iterative conversations, the goals of care or shared decision-making conversations, and that maybe in this realm of decisional support or quality of decision-making, maybe we should be less focused on outcomes and simply accept that the fact that decisions are being made in a shared way with family is itself intrinsic evidence of goal alignment.
Yeah, definitely. It's well said. I'll think about that.
Well, what have we missed in this conversation?
It's definitely made me think. How about you? Anything you think that we've missed?
I want to start a movement. I think we need to bring health systems together, because I can tell you I've talked to some attorneys about redesigning advanced care planning, and the ones within Providence, by the way, we have a fabulous legal affairs department, and they're on board. By the way, they get it. But I've talked to some external attorneys and particularly in the legislative people in legislation, and they're unwilling to give up the notary. It has almost a magical power over them. It's really odd. What I get from the healthcare law people is, if there was sufficient mass of health systems that said, this has failed, we're going to adopt a community standard, that you begin to develop a community standard that it's highly likely the judiciary would accept as evidence of the patient's wishes.
Huh.
Hi, it's Sean. I'm going to jump in with a point of personal privilege as host. You've both done a great job in this conversation pointing to the importance of naming a proxy, a surrogate decision maker, a trusted friend who knows your mind and whom you trust to act in congruence with your values if you're not able to speak for yourself. My question is, what do you do with the socially isolated patient, the lonely patient who can't name someone to serve as their proxy?
I mean, we see in the unit for sure the sort of lonely patient who tragically in the hospital, the term, I don't know if it's beyond my hospital, but the term is an unbefriended patient, which is awful, and very poignant, obviously. I mean, sometimes, we reach out to that person's physician. Do they have a good relationship? Things like that. Ultimately, if there's no one, the hospital does end up making decisions for somebody if they, are not going to be able to make decisions for themselves over a period of time until a guardian, which is really a tough scenario to be in because guardians generally err on the side of doing everything when there's anything to be done, which makes sense. They don't know this person. It is hard to back off. A legal guardian is ultimately found. So, which is even more reason for somebody who doesn't clearly have family to say, even my primary care doctor, that's somebody who I would trust, something like that. Go ahead.
So, yes, Daniela, what you said is entirely accurate. As a palliative care doc, my approach has been to those people, first to try to deliver them from anonymity.
Right.
So many consults come in to see an unbefriended patient in the ICU, and we get nosy and start calling everybody who ever touched that person that we can find, and try to find out who this person is, who, I'll make him a he for the economy of discussion, who he felt was his friends while active, what he liked or didn't like, just trying to dig into the person's history in some way. Find somebody, even if it's a nurse's aide who has been with this person, who may know him reasonably well. And then we write extensive social history notes in the chart. If we can't find anybody, any relative that we might name as some sort of default surrogate, and many of the state laws do have a kind of surrogacy ladder by relationship, then we may have to get the ethics committee involved. But we try to deliver the person from anonymity, talk about the person as a whole person, and then within the available treatment decisions or treatment available, their potential for further recovery or functional outcomes, see if we can come to some consensus. We may or may not have to get the court involved to name a guardian. If we do have one or more people who know that person and we can come to a clear consensus, meaning, just, I don't mean this to sound crass, but there's nobody to complain or sue.
Right.
Right? Then we may be able to make a decision in the person's best interest without going down that guardian route, which is really onerous to everybody involved. But we get nosy. We start poking around.
Ira, Daniela, thank you both for taking the time to engage with each other and with us today. It's been a pleasure listening to your conversation. Thanks.
An honor to speak with you. So thank you guys both so much to make me think.
I feel the same, Daniela. Keep writing. I so appreciate your perspective that you bring. It's really been so helpful in not only this topic, but many more that you've addressed. It's wonderful.
Kind of you.
Daniela Lamas is a pulmonary and critical care physician in Boston, where she practices at Brigham and Women's Hospital. She's an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. Ira Byock is a palliative care physician and the founder and senior vice president for strategic innovation at the Providence Institute for Human Caring. Ira's books include The Best Care Possible and The 4 Things That Matter Most. A reminder that we're planning a webinar on social media best practices for providers. We welcome your input and questions. Write to us here at hearmenowstories@providence.org or leave a voicemail message for us on +1 424 212 5436. That number in California is 424-212-5436. The country code is 1. The Hear Me Now podcast is a production of the Providence Institute for Human Caring, on Twitter at human_caring. The program is produced by Scott Acord and Melody Fawcett. We have research help from medical librarians, including Basha Dolofska-Elliott, Sarah Viscuso, and Heather Martin. The executive producer is Michael Drummond. Our theme music was written by Roger Neal. I'm Sean Collins. Thanks for listening. Be well.